Ken, I actually had no idea who you are when I came across your book, What the Nurses Saw, and started reading it. And I thought, I read this book on this. It's an amazing book, and I think everybody should read this book. And I thought, who is this guy? I've never heard about this Ken McCarthy. He's interviewing these nurses, other healthcare professionals, like a respiratory therapist, people who saw with their own eyes the crimes that were committed in the hospitals during COVID and who spoke out against the death protocols. So I searched for you online, and I kept finding this one person, Ken McCarthy, and it was someone it's this really famous internet pioneer who's driven the development of internet commercialization and online marketing and all this advertising methods. And I thought, well, that's not him. I mean, that's another Ken McCarthy. That's not the person who wrote this book. But I just couldn't find the Ken McCarthy, the one who had written the book. And then I've eventually asked John Baudouin, whom I recently interviewed. He's the guy who found out about the fraud on the death certificates. He has done great work. And he had introduced me to you. And I said, John, Ken McCarthy, is that the same person as the online marketing pioneer? And he said, well, he didn't know. He didn't know. He wasn't aware that you had something to do with that, but maybe you did. Okay, so anyway, I researched you some more, and then I eventually realized that it must be you. Welcome, Ken.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Yeah, I am the same person. for people that are interested in internet commercialization history, I'm one of the co-developers of the banner ad, which is the foundation of all internet commerce. There were basically three people I would say deserve credit. We each did something, and I was the person that had the original idea. Then somebody else created a company, and then somebody else went out and actually sold the first banner ad. So that's us.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty astonishing. You also came up with this metric that is used all over the place now, the click-through rate, correct?
Yeah. There was a lot of confusion and uncertainty about how the internet could be grown beyond sort of the hobbyist academic level. And it had to be commercialized at some point. And to me, the obvious thing was that to recognize that clicks had value. And I will say this, because some people say, oh, you ruined the internet. I just want to say briefly that had we not figured out a way to commercialize the internet in 1994, Bill Gates and Microsoft were on a hot trail to develop a private kind of internet that would have been their control. They controlled the desktop. This is sort of inside baseball. It's a term that we use here in America, but it means talking about something maybe not everyone is aware of. But in the 1990s, Microsoft absolutely controlled the personal computer and everything that appeared on your desktop. And they were in the process of creating their own online system, their desktop, which they controlled everybody's desktop except for a few Apple users. It would have been the portal to the online world. And so instead of having the World Wide Web with all the things we have, we would have had a proprietary system controlled by Bill Gates and Microsoft. So I know people hate advertising, but if we hadn't come up with an advertising model, the web would not have grown fast enough and quickly enough to outpace what Bill Gates and Microsoft were planning for us. So
right.
I hope people understand that.
Interesting. Didn't know that. Well, Ken, you actually wrote many books that have nothing to do with internet commercialization and online marketing. For example, you wrote Fauci's First Fraud and also Unraveling the COVID Con. And I looked you up on Wikipedia, and your Wikipedia entry doesn't mention your books about the COVID era at all. There's nothing about it. Just in the references, you find some links, but in the text itself, nothing at all.
Yeah, Wikipedia is a strange beast.
Sure is.
I had to spend well, I should say this carefully. My Wikipedia page came under an incredible attack in the 2000s. Yeah, in the 2000s, people were defacing it and sabotaging it, and they were just trying to run me off of Wikipedia. So I've just not touched it very often. I will add my new books to it, or I'll have people add new because that's an objective fact. But I'm trying to not have my Wikipedia channel attacked and undermined.
So Today, I want to talk to you about the book, What the Nurses Saw. And you published that almost exactly 2 years ago in December 2023. And the full title of the book is What the Nurses Saw, an investigation into systemic medical murders that took place in hospitals during the COVID panic and the nurses who fought back to save their patients. First of all, I'd like to know how you got into all of this, why you published this book. I mean, this has nothing to do with online marketing. How did that happen?
Well, long before COVID, I had the distinct feeling that we were living in a medical dictatorship. And I've had my own experiences, my bad experiences with organized medicine. I've had family members that have had catastrophic experiences with organized medicine. I've been aware of the arrogance and the ignorance and the heartlessness of organized medicine for decades. And when COVID came around, I instantly knew what they were up to. In fact, by the way, I'm in addition to being harassed on Wikipedia, I've also had my account apparently permanently frozen by Twitter. However, it's still visible. I just can't post to it or use Twitter to communicate with other human beings. But if you go to that account and you scroll all the way down to February 1st, 2000, when COVID was only in China, I said that this was a vaccine marketing exercise and they were going to use it as a pretense to develop, a cure for coronaviruses, which is impossible, really, and that they were going to use more speed than science. Those were two tweets that I posted February 1st, 2020. And
Wow.
when they started, and see, I'm being a marketer and having worked on hundreds of projects and studied thousands of projects, and also being a student of the history of propaganda, and an observer of the official lie machine that all governments seem to be working. My antenna is always out. My radar is always up for government fraud. And this stunk to me from day one as massive government/medical fraud, right? So we have the government and the medical dictatorship working together. And then when they shut the world down, I'm a businessman. I knew what that was going to do to the world economy. And by the way, we're all still paying the price for it 5 years later. And, as somebody who helped contribute to the multi-trillion-dollar internet economy, I took offense that they were now going to pull trillions of dollars from people like us, small business people, regular folks. Also, a weird thing, Anthony Fauci and I went to the same high school. Now, he's much older than I am, of course. And I resented that this horrible human being besmirched my high school. However, my high school loves him, and they won't carry any of my books in the school library. So he's still winning on that.
Oh, wow. So which high school is that?
It's a very unusual high school. It's called Regis High School, and it's in Manhattan. And there was a time when the Upper East Side of Manhattan was, a bunch of barns and a few shacks. And this Irish Americans used to be very put down in the United States horrifically. They would have signs saying no Irish or dogs allowed in the store. But this guy was very ambitious and very energetic, and he bought a lot of land in the Upper East Side. And in his will, he left not only a lot to build this school for Catholic boys. My family's Catholic. He also left a huge amount of money. So the school is actually fully endowed. So everybody that goes, it's a private school and a very good one. But everyone that goes there goes for free. So it's a way for poor Catholic boys to get a world-class secondary education. So I got into that school. It's quite hard to get into. And Fauci went there too.
So you said that your X account was permanently frozen. When did that happen?
March 21.
And it's still frozen today?
I write them emails. I send them certified letters to their legal department. They completely ignore me. Wow. They want me to remove a post. And
Which
I refused
one?
to. The last post I made was there are a lot of, you might not be surprised that there are a lot of journalists that are on the payroll of pharma and or the government. And there was one in particular who in March of 2021 was crowing, praising himself about how insightful he was, that in fact, yes, we would come up with a rapid coronavirus vaccine. And I said, this guy's a representative of the legion of journalistic shills who fomented terror. So I posted that, and immediately my account was frozen. Now, what's interesting is the day before I had posted something that had gotten very good traction. A lot of people were reading it and a lot of people were sharing it. So my guess is the algorithm put me on the watch list because I was starting to get some traction. And then the human beings started reading my posts, and they saw my unacceptable, because I posted a lot of harsh stuff, but they never said anything because I wasn't getting much traction. But then after getting a little bit of exposure on my channel, and I posted this, and then immediately they locked me out. And I refused to pull back my statement. I think it's absolutely accurate.
And they told you that they told you that if you would retract that statement or delete that post, they would unban you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but I refuse.
Good.
I don't need Twitter anyway, and I did the math on how many days of my life cumulatively were wasted on Twitter, and I'm very glad to be off of it.
Now, in the introduction to your book, What the Nurses Saw, you write, and I quote, "A book like this could have appeared as early as the fall of 2020." So, in other words, 3 years before you published your book. That it is only appearing now towards the end of 2023 and had to be compiled by someone who is not a journalist, not a historian, not an attorney, not a medical ethics professional, and not a professional public health advocate is an indication of how thoroughly and completely the decent people of the world have been abandoned by the so-called establishment. And it's now 2 years since you published your book, as I said earlier. But it seems to me that we are still abandoned by the so-called establishment, because 2 years later, nobody officially acknowledged the hospital murders. Nobody has been held accountable. So what do you think? In 50 years, in 100 years, will anybody know that this happened?
Well, if they read my book, they'll know. But otherwise, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of things that have happened, and which is one of my motivations for writing it. But there's a lot of things that happen in this world that are not never documented. And that old saying, "If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, did it really fall? Does it matter?" Yeah, this is a strange one. There is and I'm sorry I can't remember his name, but he's a nurse educator in England, John Campbell. And he has a huge chat channel. I've tried to reach him, by the way. John, if you're watching this, would you please answer my emails? But he's doing some really good work. And one of the things he's doing is pointing out the number of nursing home, that's what we call them in English, nursing home patients, older people, who are, frail, no longer able to take care of themselves. He's pointing out the number of nursing home patients that died as a result of getting high doses of drugs they should never have been given. So he's starting to do a little documentation, but I was documenting the actual protocols used on so-called COVID patients, and which is a different thing entirely.
So in your book, you have several and extremely interesting and revealing interviews with nurses, 2 American nurses and also a nurse in the UK, about what they saw happen in hospitals during COVID. And one of the American nurses you interviewed is Erin Olszewski. Another one is Nicole Serotek. And you dedicated your book to her, to Nicole. So tell me about Nicole.
The original book was absolutely dedicated to her. So, though I broadened it, in a new edition, I broadened it to all the nurses that fought back. In this sequence of events, Erin Olszewski was the first nurse that got the word out as to what was happening. And she did it through a colleague. The reason she didn't initially do it publicly is she stayed on the job to document what was going on. And she documented, with video, audio, taking records. She was the first person to stand up and say, and this was very early on, to say there's something horribly wrong going on. And then Nicole was the first nurse to show her face on a YouTube channel. And I wasn't aware of that. I wasn't aware that Erin was first and Nicole was second. So initially I thought Nicole was the first. So I wanted to honor her as the first, but she's clearly one of the first. But then I realized, hey, every nurse that fought back, and there weren't very many of them, I'm afraid, but every nurse that fought back and paid a price, because all the nurses that fought back paid some kind of a price, should be honored for what they attempted to do, which was save their patients' lives.
Mm-hmm. And on May 1st, 2020, Nicole Serotek, she did a Facebook Live video from the hospital where she was working that went viral. And I would like to have a look at what she actually said there. I'm not going to play the video, but I would like to have a look at the text and ask you. We can go through some of what she said and ask you about it. So that was May 1st, 2020, and she worked as a travel nurse in New York City during COVID. You know, at the time when New York City was known in the entire world as the place where most people died of allegedly COVID, right?
Yeah.
And she was right there, right in the middle of it in a hospital. I'm here in the book, in Ken's book, What the Nurses Saw, and he included the entire text of what she said on that day, May 1st, 2020. All right, so starts off with, hey everyone, great goodness, it is 8:42 New York time, and I got to my regular unit and they took my patient away. And now I'm getting switched units, so which means she's being transferred to another department within the hospital, I guess, correct?
Correct.
This is exactly what happened before at the other hospital. So apparently she was at another hospital and she was getting switched from one unit to the other. As soon as I told somebody in management what was going on and tried to advocate for my patient, they take the patient away from me and then they moved me. I legitimately don't even know what to do anymore. Even the advocacy groups don't give a shit about these people. Nobody is listening. I'm going to skip this paragraph here. Nobody is listening. They don't care what is happening to these people. They don't. I'm literally coming here every day and watching them kill them. I don't even know what to do anymore. I tried calling advocacy groups. I tried talking with management here, like the nursing admin. Nothing. Nobody's doing anything. We still have 100% mortality rate in the ICU unit until I just left. And by the way, I'm just reading this, so, in like a calm voice, but she was actually sobbing during this, or she, at least during part, while she was reading it, she started sobbing. They literally don't even know when a patient is dead. How many times have I told you they have assigned me a dead person? How long have they been dead? Nobody knows. This is also interesting what she says here. How is anybody assessing anything without a stethoscope? Normally we have those disposable stethoscopes, but I knew what we were coming into, so I brought my own chunky one. Nobody's listened to anybody's lungs as long as I have been here, even with disposable stethoscopes. I'm not a doctor, but I'm pretty sure that when you defibrillate somebody with a heartbeat of 40 and a stable rhythm and you kill them, that's murder. And I'm pretty sure that when you put somebody's PEP, that's the positive and expiratory pressure on a ventilator, up to like 25, and you blow their lungs out and they die, I'm pretty sure that's murder. By the way, I read, Ken, that the usual setting on a ventilator is something around 5. And they were putting it up to like 25, 5 times that.
In this hospital, yes, yeah.
I mean, I just watched a doctor drop a central line and rupture the subclavian vein, and the guy bled to death. COVID didn't place that central line. COVID didn't kill that guy. I watched an anesthesiologist place an ET tube. That was probably an intubation, what he was doing there to place an ET tube, and rupture their esophagus, and the guy choked to death on his own blood. COVID didn't place that ET tube incorrectly. They are not dying of COVID, okay? And then further down here, I'm literally telling you that they are murdering these people and nobody will listen to me. I tried talking to hospital management. I tried calling CMS. So CMS is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. I tried calling the equivalent of their division of aging. I tried calling a couple of Black power groups in that area. I tried contacting a newspaper. Nobody called me back. Like for real, nobody's listening. I even tried getting a hold of Black advocacy groups. They just put me on hold or hang up on me. I tried talking to management, and now I got moved units. So she complained to her managers and she got moved. I don't know what to do anymore. Can someone come up with some type of solution for me, because I'm out of ideas? So that was her video.
Yep. Yep. And to put this in context, if everybody can remember, the COVID panic began in China, and it appeared to be limited to China. And everybody sort of watched in horror and assumed it was never going to come to beyond China. Then it ended up in northern, not southern, by the way, northern northern Italy, which is the industrialized part of Italy. It's a valley area that has a lot of, you don't think of Italy generally as an industrial powerhouse, but if you look at the north of Italy, it is. I think it's the second biggest concentration of heavy industry in Europe. It's also got the oldest population, and it has an annual problem with overrunning its hospitals because, like the United States, and unlike places like Germany and Korea and Japan, Italy tries to have as few hospital beds as possible. So every year when the flu comes around, they have catastrophes in the hospital wards because they just don't have enough beds. So they made a big media spectacle out of Italy. And then, so all of us, in the European world and people with European ancestry said, "Oh my God, this is happening not just in China, it's happening in Italy." And then the next place was New York, and it seemed to be focused. The virus magically moved from China to northern Italy to New York City, right, and just stayed in New York City for a while. And now once in New York City, the rest of the country watched in horror and terror and hope that somehow this virus would not come to the rest of the country. But this was set up like a movie, like a stage drama. And interestingly enough, something that I wasn't able to put in the book, Anthony Fauci is of Italian-American ancestry. And of course, he has a very powerful position in the U.S. medical bureaucracy, which is a powerful thing to have globally. And many, many, many Italian physicians come to work as an apprentice in Anthony Fauci's division of NIH. That's been happening over decades. And they spend years, and then they go back and they're in positions of power in hospitals and medical schools and so on. So Anthony Fauci had a personal network in northern Italy. And I keep stressing northern Italy because you didn't have the same level of death rates in southern Italy, which is a less economically developed area. It's practically a different country economically. But in the highly medicalized northern Italy, where Anthony Fauci had a lot of personal, close connections with medical leadership, that's where you had this big outbreak of COVID. And then, of course, it came to New York City. And the New York City thing was a total travesty. There would be a trailer truck parked in the next to a hospital, and they would declare that it was for dead bodies. But anybody that's aware of trailer trucks knows you kind of need to have a refrigerated trailer truck. And some of these trailer trucks were not refrigerated. So in other words, they were just taking a picture of a truck, framing it, and saying, "Oh, this is where all the dead bodies are."
Mm-hmm.
The other thing they did in New York is if somebody dies and they don't have family to come and claim the body, those bodies are buried by the city. And there's an actual island where they're buried. And this has been going on for over 150 years. It's nothing new. But during COVID, and the burials are not very pretty. They have a bulldozer. They dig out a whole bunch of earth, and then they just lay in a whole bunch of wooden caskets all at once. This has been going on forever. This is where New York City is a big place. A lot of people die. A percentage of those people die without the means for burial. So the city takes care of it, but they don't do it in a very beautiful way. Well, what they did during COVID was they flew drones over this island and had headlines. Oh my God, so many people are dying. It's over. They can't handle it. It's overflowing. It was just business as usual. People die. The other problem that happened in New York City and elsewhere in the country is the funeral homes, the places that usually take care of people in their after their death and arrange for the burials. They were all shut down. So dead bodies were piling up at the hospitals, not because of an extreme amount of death, but because the bodies, logistically, they weren't moving out the way they needed to. So they created a terror scenario in real life. I mean, it was terrible. So New York City was the first place in the United States that supposedly had the outbreak, and they brought in many traveling nurses, as you mentioned earlier. Nicole was one. Now Nicole and Erin, and actually all the nurses that I interviewed, but Nicole and Erin were veteran nurses. Nicole in particular had worked in refugee camps in Syria. She was an air nurse. In other words, let's say there's an accident in the mountains and you can't get, the ambulance is going to take 4 hours to get there and 4 hours to get back. She's the kind of nurse that would be on a helicopter going there and treating people right on the spot with the doctors. So this was a very experienced nurse. This was not somebody that, had a year of practice and didn't know what she was seeing. When she says patients were being killed, her assessment is very accurate.
Mm-hmm.
So what she's describing, what Nicole was describing, was just gross incompetence. And the reason there was gross incompetence is horrifying. And so this is how it worked. You'd come to a hospital with any ailment at all, could be anything, and you would be given a COVID test. And if you didn't test positive, they would test you again. And if you didn't test positive from that test, they would test you again. And they would continually test you until they could come up with a positive COVID test, at which point you'd be declared a COVID patient, regardless of what your problem was. And once you were declared a COVID patient, you were put into a COVID ward, special COVID ward. And in that COVID ward, all previous legal and medical procedure was thrown out the window. One of the horrifying things they did was they said, hey, we'll take any doctor, we'll take any nurse. So you could be a doctor, let's say from another country that barely speaks English. We assume these people were doctors. We really don't know because everything was done in such a rush. And you could be a doctor that had never worked in an ICU, intensive care unit in your life. You'd never stepped foot into one. You were a podiatrist, or an orthopedist. And now you're getting a very large salary. The nurses were paid, the contract nurses were paid by the federal government here, $10,000 US dollars per week.
I know, it's absolutely crazy what they were paid. But I want to interrupt you here because what you just said about these doctors that came from other countries and might not even have been really qualified, that's something very interesting. I think that is not very well known because you ask yourself, well, that cannot possibly be true because that would be forbidden. You have to have certain, your doctor's license has to be accepted here in the United States, and that's very difficult. Everybody knows that. So how is it possible? It cannot possibly be true. But in your discussion or in your interview with A.J. DePriest, she mentions the waivers. And that, for example, was something that I hadn't really been aware of. And since you just brought that up, let's go to the interview and let's have a look at these waivers, because there wasn't just a waiver for doctors, there were other waivers as well. Okay, here we go. So maybe you can quickly tell a little bit about who A.J. DePriest is, and then we'll have a look at the what she said about these waivers.
Okay. So AJ is a very skilled medical administrator and very familiar with the finances of hospitals and the practice of medicine, and a very good researcher. And she's also part of a group of citizen researchers that did really deep research into the financial structures behind what took place in the hospitals. So she's a very bright and very insightful and very hardworking person, and did just fantastic research. Her contribution to the book was essential. In fact, she allowed, not only did I interview her, she allowed me to reproduce a very detailed report on the financial incentives that the hospitals were receiving for doing what they did.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, she's famous for tracing the money trail, the financial motivations behind the COVID, these death protocols that were used in the hospitals. And she documented what monies the hospitals received. And I would like to show some interesting graphs from your book a little bit later. And you interviewed her for the book, and she talked about the money trail and all this, but she also talked about these waivers. So let's, I'm not quite here. That's not the right page, but here we go. So she started talking about the waivers, and then she said, never in the history of healthcare, that's down here, never in the history of healthcare, and I've been working in healthcare since the early 90s, in healthcare administration and policy analysis and legislation. So never since the early 90s had I ever seen a violation of patients' rights as I've seen during COVID. So she says here that we found that CMS, so that's the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, we found that CMS issued a series of waivers in early 2020 that allowed hospitals to do things for which they would have been sued and had the funding guts ripped out of them if they had done these things before COVID. People who work for the hospital associations have told us these things are not happening in hospitals. They would lose all their funding. Indeed they would. But these waivers allowed hospitals to throw away their patient bill of rights. So this patient bill of rights was apparently thrown out, didn't exist anymore. So, well, actually, this is interesting too. There's a hospital in Tennessee, and that hospital told a family, we don't have a patient bill of rights. They said that. We don't have a patient bill of rights. A hospital that accepts federal funding would never tell a family that before COVID. Think about it. Remember how walking into a hospital posted on every wall and every hallway would be the patient bill of rights. If admitted to a hospital, your admission packet would include the patient's bill of rights. You'd have a website where you and your family members could access your medical records. That is no more. That was a CMS waiver that they could take up to 90 days to give the family access to medical records. So in other words, the family didn't know what they were doing with you in the hospital, because it would take 90 days before anything would appear on that website. It used to be immediate. And then it also says the waivers also allowed hospitals to not give food, water, or personal care to patients for up to 48 hours. It's unbelievable. But we have heard so many accounts, there's so many accounts of people, family members who had parents die, for example, who said, my mother wasn't fed, my father wasn't given any water. They were left lying in their excrements. They weren't getting a bath, and so on. So there was a waiver for that. That was actually legal during COVID. Families were telling us we have a loved one in the hospital who hasn't even had a drink of water in 2 days. Yeah, there are many such records, or is lying in their own feces because they are restrained in the bed and they can't get up to go to the bathroom. And so what was the rationalization for these waivers? Very interesting. So AJ DePriest says, because hospitals were so overwhelmed. They said they had to forego some of these human rights, these basic patient and human rights, all in the name of COVID. And, that is actually not true. The hospitals were not overwhelmed because they sent everybody home. They shut down entire wards. They didn't do all of that outpatient stuff. They canceled all sorts of surgeries. They were not overwhelmed. A lot of hospitals were pretty much empty except for the COVID patient that they accepted. So this is a complete lie that the hospitals were overwhelmed.
Right. And just to be clear, AJ is not giving credence to that lie. She's just stating what the hospitals claimed.
Exactly. This is what the hospital said. So this was the reason if in case anybody asks, hospitals are so overwhelmed. So, we won't feed you. We won't, we'll just kill you.
And by the way, we see what doctors and nurses, real doctors and nurses, do in extremity, as we watch the news from Gaza every day. They don't not give water. I mean, what could be more impossible than the conditions that they're working under, being bombed, having no electricity? There's no talk about not giving water to a patient for 48 hours. So this was something made up by the federal government here in the United States, passed on to the hospital administrators, and the administrators passed it on to the staff. And unfortunately, the vast majority of the staff were very happy to go along with this. But
Yeah,
you're right. It's a fraud 10 different ways.
yeah, a good point. And I mean, if you want to expedite someone's death, then you don't give them water. We can't live very long without water. Then she goes,
Especially
yeah,
when you're sick.
yes, especially when you're sick. I mean, the first thing when you go to the hospital is usually that they put a line into your arm to give you fluids, right? You need to get fluids. They want to get fluids into you. So then she says there were also waivers that allowed Medicare patients to not have a health plan. When Medicare patients are admitted to the hospital, they are given a plan for the course of treatment in the hospital. That was waived. And now comes the point that you made earlier. There was a waiver that allowed doctors from all over the world, doctors who had suspended licenses, nurses with suspended licenses, and doctors with foreign licenses to come and practice in hospitals. We started to hear people say, there are all these doctors treating our loved one and they barely speak English. We don't know where these doctors come from. There were many foreign doctors and nurses. And then further down, she says, they were coming from all over the world. They were not licensed under the U.S. healthcare system. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, just so for people to get perspective, until the COVID panic, you could be the finest ICU doctor in Germany. You could be the professor. You could be the author of the textbook. You could have 40 years of experience. If you set foot in America, you're qualified to do nothing until you go through a very difficult licensing process. And that's was completely thrown out the window. So anybody who could claim to be a doctor, and I think some people snuck in that weren't even doctors, were hired and paid to operate in these ICU units. Again, doctors who we assume they're doctors. Many of them had trouble expressing themselves in English. Many of them, most of them, the vast majority of them had no relevant medical experience. They just theoretically had a medical degree from somewhere. That's another thing. You would never put a doctor in an ICU or even a nurse that didn't have specific ICU experience and training. So that was another crazy thing that happened. So that explains the incompetence and the malpractice that Nicole was talking about. But there's something even worse that was going on. And this again flowed from on high from the government. They created a financial incentive system that incentivized medical procedures that made no medical, scientific, or logical sense, that were unprecedented in the history of medicine. I could talk about that because I think that's where the vast majority of people, I say, were killed. And the reason I say killed is in an emergency, if let's say you're confronting something you've never seen before and you're told this is the treatment, I cannot blame anybody for using that treatment 1 or 2 or 3 times because, you have to depend on other people. But after seeing people die over and over and over and over again, at a certain point, it becomes manslaughter or murder. And so what the federal government of the United States did, and I don't know how they did this in other countries specifically, but in the U.S., they incentivized a protocol which virtually guaranteed that people that came to the hospital with respiratory problems were going to die. Not everyone died, but over 1 million people died in U.S. hospitals. Can I talk to you about that and tell you the protocol that they used?
Yes, yes, do that. But before I want to ask you about this next sentence here in the text, and then we can go to the incentive structure. So you said to AJ DePriest, after she talked about the waivers for the doctors, you said to her, Erin, so Erin Olszewski, the nurse we talked about earlier, Erin told me they were being paid. So these foreign doctors and nurses, they were being paid by Homeland Security. So that's, wow, that struck me as
Well, the
really
money
interesting.
had
Yeah.
to come from somewhere. And I guess there were big pots of money available in Homeland Security. And the way it worked was there were private contractors who would arrange for the labor. They would recruit and hire and deliver the workers. Homeland Security would pay those contractors, and then the contractors would pay the nurses. So the money ultimately came from Homeland Security. But something people should consider, people that do operate those kind of businesses don't do it for free. They charge a percentage. So if a nurse was making $10,000 a week, the contractor could have been making up to $10,000 a week themselves. We don't really know exactly what Homeland Security was paying the contractor, but we do know that the nurses were getting paid $10,000 a month. So the point is, there were a handful of privately owned medical labor contractors, I'm sure well politically connected, that made many, 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 many millions of dollars. And the quality of their work was obviously very low because they were using these waivers that the government gave them to bring over unqualified doctors and nurses. I mean, they had nurses working in the ICUs that hadn't even gotten their nursing degree yet. They were still students.
Yes, correct.
And this is almost guarantees injury and death.
Yeah. Yeah. So doctors and nurses are not usually paid by Homeland Security, but it does, yes, but it does make sense that these foreign doctors and foreign nurses are paid by Homeland Security. I wouldn't be surprised at all if that were true, because as we know from Debbie Lerman and Sasha Latipova, who researched this extensively and published about it, also extensively, the COVID dossier, for example, that you can find on their Substacks, provides a ton of information about this, namely that it was the military and the intelligence services that were in charge of the COVID response. Debbie Lerman found the PANCAP, the PANCAP plans, or the pandemic planning document that had been changed for the COVID pandemic. And it says in there, black on white, that it is the National Security Council that is in charge and the intelligence services, and not, as should have been, the responsible agency should have been HHS, was not in charge. And then FEMA actually belongs to Homeland Security, or reports to Homeland Security, and FEMA was put in charge. I think they call it the lead agency. So FEMA was the lead agency.
And FEMA means Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Yeah, they never have anything to do with pandemics, or no, that's they are, when there are typhoons and all sorts of natural disasters, that's their area.
Well, what's interesting is I've seen FEMA up close operate both in New York City and in New Orleans, where I spent a lot of time after the hurricane there. And they were absolutely inept, incompetent, uncaring, disorganized, wasteful. In fact, I learned this from somebody I know who's a member of the underworld. He said the drug dealers in New Orleans had a temporary loss of business because so many people left town, the illegal drug dealers. But when the FEMA employees arrived, all that business came back. It's a little tidbit of knowledge that probably no one's ever heard before, but I got it from a trusted source in New Orleans who knew what he was talking about.
Interesting. Let's go to the incentive structure for the hospitals to administer these protocols that killed people, these death protocols. So the CARES Act, the CARES Act was passed end of March 2020. It was passed really quickly. The CARES Act funding was absolutely enormous. I think it was about it was something like $180 billion that went to hospitals or healthcare providers immediately in some sort of first phase relief funding, almost $180 billion. I mean, imagine that. They were just swimming. There was tons of money available. And tell me a little bit about how hospitals were incentivized to do what they did.
Okay, so a protocol was established by, I imagine, the CDC. And I've actually asked AJ about that, and maybe she's found out about that since. But we know that at some level, at the federal level, medical officials established a protocol. It's like, oh, we have a pandemic. It's a disease. Here's how we recommend that it be treated. So the first recommendation also went against all previous medical history. If you have a respiratory problem, whatever the source is, you need two things right away. One is an anti-inflammatories, right, to help keep the inflammation down. And the other thing that helps is inhalable steroids. So this assists somebody that's having breathing difficulties. Anybody that appeared in a U.S. hospital and got a positive COVID test result was not given anti-inflammatories or inhalable steroids. In other words, this would be the equivalent. Now, and there may be doctors that think, well, there's other ways to treat it and so on, but that's the standard of care. It's just normal. It's like you have a cut, you clean it, you put a Band-Aid on. Nothing to dispute, no non-controversial. But in COVID, if you were a COVID patient, you didn't get that treatment. So this would be the equivalent of a house on fire. The fire engine, rolls up in front of it, and the firemen just stand there and do nothing. So that was step one of the COVID protocol as determined by the federal government. Related to this, and you can imagine that a lot of people that showed up with respiratory distress, which is, respiratory distress is a real thing. It happens to a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. And if it happened in the context of the COVID panic with the terror campaign in the media, and you found yourself in a hospital, you were probably highly anxious and highly concerned. So related to this protocol, the doctors or the nurses or whoever was working would say to the patient, you seem upset. Would you like to take something to help you with your anxiety? Now, two things about that. One, as soon as you admit to anxiety and take an anxiety medication, you are now a psychiatric patient. If you were in the hospital and you didn't like the way you were being treated, you can just walk out. However, if you are a psychiatric patient, you are now someone of theoretical risk to yourself and others. So the hospital could hold you for a longer period. They could actually hold you against your will. That's step one. The other aspect of this is tranquilizers work by relaxing your muscles, and your diaphragm, which is that's why we're able to breathe, is a muscle. So if you give somebody tranquilizers, you're going to reduce their ability to breathe. They're not giving you anti-inflammatories. They're applying you with tranquilizers. They're reducing your capacity to breathe. The next thing they did was use non-invasive ventilation, which is like a face mask that's put on your face and tied very tightly. And they just pump air into you very fast. And it's a very uncomfortable procedure. It's a very anxiety-provoking procedure. Under normal circumstances, the patient would be, everything would be explained to the patient. Hey, this is you seem to be having real difficulty in breathing. We're going to try this to help you. It's not comfortable, but don't worry. We're here. If you want it to stop, just let us know. With COVID, they just slap it on, no explanation, and then leave the patient alone in the room with this air just, but they're not prepared. They're not ready. They don't know what it is. And a lot of people became very anxious, at which point they would definitely be given tranquilizers. The next step was that you'd be offered Remdesivir. And Remdesivir was a drug they experimented on Africans with it during Ebola. And they discovered that it doesn't work and it appears to cause kidney failure. So it was removed. But then during COVID, somehow Anthony Fauci, in his wisdom, decided that Remdesivir was the cure for COVID, the treatment for COVID. And he decreed that this would be the treatment for COVID. All of the treatments not permitted, ivermectin and all the other things that were possible. And then the federal government gave a financial incentive to hospitals. They not only got paid their normal money to do the medical service, they got a bonus from the federal government for each course of Remdesivir that they gave a patient. And the man you mentioned, John, how do you say his last name? Is Bodine?
I'm not really sure. Baudouin, but it's a French name. But in English, I guess you pronounce it Baudouin or something like that.
Yeah, he lives in Massachusetts, and there were a lot of French Canadians that moved to Massachusetts at one time. So John's done a very careful study that shows very clearly this was the level of kidney failure Remdesivir was introduced, the level of kidney failure went to the moon. Now, again, I mentioned earlier, if you're in an emergency situation and you're told by someone that you think you can trust, this is the treatment, you give the treatment. But it became very clear, and that was one of the reasons Nicole was taken out of the ICU in her hospital. She refused after a short time. She said, everybody we give this drug to dies. I'm not giving anybody else this drug anymore. At which point this highly experienced ICU nurse, perhaps the only one on her ward that had any relevant experience at all, was removed from the ICU and put on a pointless make work project like folding towels and so on. So the remdesivir was given to everybody that got a positive COVID test. And then related to that, they would then say, hey, this non-invasive ventilation isn't working. We're going to help you. And they would say, we even have a video of this that was accidentally broadcast on the news. A medical doctor telling a patient, if you accept this ventilation, invasive, they didn't call it a ventilation, they called it invasive, they just called it venting. You'll get out of here quicker. Nothing could be further from the truth. Invasive ventilation is a medical procedure, and there are cases where it is necessary. If somebody's diaphragm has become paralyzed from trauma or some extreme conditions, you need to breathe for them. But it is it's a very invasive medical procedure. A hose, which is nicknamed the garden hose, is put down your throat. And in order for that to take place, you have to be knocked out with one or more drugs. You're also given paralytic drugs that keep you from moving. And you're also given analgesics like fentanyl. And you could be given anywhere from 4, I think it was up to 15 drugs. And these are not a pill that you take once. These are bags of drug that are given to you intravenously. So a vented patient would be unconscious, unable to feed themselves, unable to clean themselves, obviously, unable to go to the bathroom, unable to drink, and they would be paralyzed. It's anesthesia, essentially. And there would be, anywhere from, 3 to 4 to 12 bags hanging going into your veins. Now, this is something
right, and it's really like an induced coma. I mean, it's like these people are completely unconscious, and usually, I mean, before COVID, if you intubated someone usually you shouldn't intubate people for more than a couple of hours during surgery, for example. But if you intubate people for days or weeks, it becomes extremely dangerous. And you have to feed them and you have to give them water. And I think it was in your book that I read that the nurses said that often these intubated COVID patients did not get an IV line for water and for food. So they didn't get any nourishment, nor did they get water. They just got the liquid from all these drugs.
They might, I'd have to double check on the food thing. I think they were getting nutrient, but the nutrient is, sugar, water.
Not all of them. That's what I read. Maybe I didn't read it in your book, but I read it somewhere that a lot of these patients didn't even get the nutrient, the bag with the nutrient.
I wouldn't be surprised. I would not be at all surprised. I would not be at all surprised.
Makes sense. I mean, if they don't feed people who are conscious, why would they feed people that are not conscious?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But I do know absolutely many of those patients were not given water of any kind.
Yeah.
And the idea was, well, there's liquid in the bags of drugs, so that's enough liquid for them. But two things about intubation. First of all, you're right to compare it to surgery. You knock somebody out, you have to paralyze them with drugs. Otherwise, you don't want somebody, thrashing around in the middle of an operation. When the operation's over, an anesthesiologist carefully brings the person back immediately. You don't keep them under anesthesia for days or weeks. With this kind of invasive intubation, the goal is to get the person off as quickly as possible. And so a respiratory therapist, and that's a person who manages people that are in this state. And by the way, a professional who does that might be managing 3, maybe 4 patients total. During COVID, you might have one respiratory therapist for an entire ward, 20, 30 people. So that was a disaster in the making. But the key to respiratory therapy, besides monitoring and making sure the person's okay, is to test to see if you can get them off as soon as you possibly can. And during the COVID panic, the federal government of the United States and the medical bureaucracy, and what I call medical dictatorship, decreed that hospitals would get paid if they put somebody in intubation, and 2, they'd get an additional bonus if they kept them on intubation for more than 96 hours. Never before in the history of medicine has that ever been a thing. You always want to get people off right away. The other thing, and I think this should be stated, this invasive intubation is never done casually. It's never done automatically. It's never done lightly. You only do it if somebody is literally dying, and the only possible way you can save them is to take over their breathing for them. During COVID, people were routinely just slapped into intubation just because they were COVID patients, and it was a trail. No care, number one. No anti-inflammatories, no inhalable steroids, given tranquilizers, given remdesivir, given this very uncomfortable external ventilation. And then they say, hey, look, you're not doing, and at that point they would say, listen, you're not doing too well. Would you consent to a procedure that we believe will help you? And that would be the full force intubation and ventilation.
Yeah, exactly. And you explain in your book really well how intubation works and why it is so dangerous. I didn't know anything about that before, but it's really good to know this, because I thought, oh yeah, you intubate somebody, not a big deal. No, not at all. It's a very big deal. It's very dangerous. And the reason is that when we breathe, we just suck in the air. We suck it into our lungs, and then we breathe out. Now, intubation works in exactly the opposite way. The air is pumped into your lung. So the air comes into your lung at a pressure and hits the walls of your lungs. If that pressure is too high, or even if it's just like it should be, if you do that long enough, every time you pump in that air into the lungs, it puts pressure, it exerts pressure on your lungs that is not good for your lungs, and that will eventually shred your lungs. If you dial up, if you dial up this intubation this ventilator to something like 25, it literally shreds your lungs. So it's very dangerous, even if done correctly.
Even done correctly, when needed by a highly skilled person, it's recognized as a very dangerous procedure that requires a high level of skill and care. Not something you do casually, and not something you just put somebody on. They would put people on these vents and then keep the drugs in the hallway with the lines going from the doorway into the patient, and they would be changing the bags of drugs without ever assessing the patient at all. They wouldn't even look. And Nicole mentioned
the patient might have died in the meantime. I mean,
Nicole mentioned this. She everyone needs to sleep. So she would finish her shift. She'd go home. She'd eat. She'd sleep. She'd come back to work. She'd be assigned a patient. She'd go to the room. The patient was dead and had been dead for who knows how many hours because nobody had ever looked at them.
Yeah. So mortality rate apparently goes up. That's I think that was also in your book, goes up by 25%. That is what one of these highly qualified nurses said. Or maybe it was Olszewski, the respiratory therapist that you interviewed. So it was probably him who said 25% mortality goes up by 25%. That's the risk of intubation. Very, very risky. And then they also let people, because they didn't have enough respiratory therapists. I mean, after all, it didn't used to be a procedure that was done all the time, everywhere.
Right.
They just asked nurses or doctors who really didn't know how to run these very sophisticated machines and how to do it correctly. They asked them to do it, and that explains what Nicole said, in her video, where she said, oh, he was rupturing his esophagus and he was choking on his own blood, the patient, because the doctor didn't know how to do it. It's very difficult to do. And these respiratory therapists, I learned that all from your book and from this great interview you did with Olszewski.
Yeah.
He said to become a respiratory therapist, you have to go through several years of very rigorous training. It's a highly specialized healthcare profession to be a respiratory therapist. And these guys, they know how to intubate people and to run the ventilators, things that not even the pulmonologists, the lung experts, know to do as well as
they don't know. They don't know how to do it. They pass that under normal circumstances. They pass that off to the respiratory therapist. But yeah, the point you're making is they had doctors with MDs, perhaps a podiatrist, who had no training in this very, sensitive, invasive procedure, trying it out, trying to figure out how to do it. Well, we got to put the hose down there, so let's just put it down. Insane. Now, if we're talking about a true end of the world, a comet has hit the world and, the whole world's in flames, well, maybe you just have to do whatever you do. But this was never necessary. And it was systematized and it was incentivized by the federal government of the United States.
Since we are talking about the ventilators, I would also like to mention that there was an EUA, so an emergency use authorization for ventilators. There were all sorts of EUAs. There was one for Remdesivir, by the way, for a long time. We can go into that a little bit more later. But for the ventilators, in March 2020 already, so again, very early on, the FDA issued an EUA that allowed emergency use for things like, I don't know, some sort of gas machines that don't really qualify as ventilator, and other ventilators that are not usually used for intubating people. They allowed to use these devices and also all sorts of accessories for intubation. So that they had more so-called ventilators. Now all of a sudden they were ventilators good enough to intubate people, so that they could intubate more people. And almost everyone who got Remdesivir and got intubated died. I mean, it was like 85%, maybe 90%. These people died; they did not survive.
And it's not medically clear that they should have ever been intubated at all in the first place.
Yes, talk about that. Yes.
Well, again, this it's an invasive procedure. It's a dangerous procedure. It's a last resort procedure. It's good that it exists. We have professionals that know how to do it, but it's not something that you should just routinely just throw people into it because they're having some respiratory distress. There's an interesting wrinkle to this. The hysteria about the need for additional respirators originated in New York State.
Yeah, Cuomo screaming for 40,000 ventilators. Why he didn't get them?
Yelling, screaming. And this is a man whose degree was in political science. I think he went to law school. His father had been governor of New York at one point as well. And that's his sole qualification for having any opinion whatsoever. But there is a little back channel here that people weren't aware of. Anthony Fauci and Mario Cuomo, the father, were very close. And Anthony Fauci was friends of the Cuomo family for decades, knew the boys, Andrew.
I didn't know that. How interesting.
Oh, yeah. Nobody knows this. And they were literally on the phone with Fauci on a daily basis because they knew him. And he was feeding them the hysteria, and they, in their ignorance, because there's a brother, too, who was a newscaster. So on the one hand, you had the newscaster on CNN, I believe it was, or MSNBC. Doesn't really matter. They're all the same. Spouting the hysteria on TV. And then you had the governor screaming, hey, we need more respirators. And they were getting all this information directly fed to them by Anthony Fauci.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean,
unfortunately, he ended up getting lots and lots of ventilators. They were sent to New York.
And
who knows now that I know about this EUA, who knows how many of these things that were sent to New York, because where all of a sudden would they get 40,000 ventilators from, right? It's a crazy number of ventilators.
Well,
maybe a lot of these ventilators weren't real ventilators, but under EUA, they qualified as a ventilator.
I don't know that they got them all, and I think it's great if they didn't, because they were not needed and they were dangerous.
They got a lot. lot.
But that's how that hysteria was pumped via the news and via the governor of New York. Because remember, the first outbreak in America was in New York City and only New York City. Theoretically, that's what they claim.
Yes, and then everybody was scared to death. It was very similar, like in Europe. You already mentioned Italy and North Italy, and it was actually Bergamo, a city in North Italy, where they had this insane spike of deaths. And there is a professor, an economics professor in Germany. His name is Stefan Homburg. He was kicked out of the university during COVID because he didn't go along with the narrative, and they kicked him out. But he has been giving talks since then. And he just gave a really interesting talk where he showed the spike in Bergamo. And I wish I had the graph here. So there was a spike, it was like kind of normal death rate in Bergamo, North Italy. And then all of a sudden there was this 1 week in March where there was an unbelievable spike, which just go up and then it immediately went down and went back to the normal death rate. And you look at that and you think, what the heck is going on there? How can that possibly? I mean, if it's a pandemic, you would think, well, maybe it shoots up, but then it kind of stays up. It doesn't just go down and up and down within a week. And then they had these, I think it was military trucks driving at night through Bergamo, and that was all over the news with, I don't know, corpses or patients or whatever. It was all a huge performance to scare people. And it worked really well. And Professor Homburg said that nobody knows what happened in Bergamo in this week. Nobody knows how to explain this unbelievable spike in deaths. Is this even real? What happened in Bergamo? Nobody knows. But it worked because people got very frightened. Italy locked down. And then Italy locked down without, too many protests. And that was the test case. Italy locked down, and then the rest of Europe locked down. And in the United States was New York City. People got really scared when they saw what happened in New York City.
And I have to point out, I want to remind everybody that Anthony Fauci not only had a direct line to the governor of the state of New York, he also had a direct line to many of the highest level medical people in northern Italy based on the fact that so many of them received training at NIH, specifically with him because, he's Italian American, they're Italian, and there was this natural affinity. He brags about this. There's a video we have somewhere. I've got so much material. I don't know if I could put my fingers on it, but we have it where he's actually on an Italian American cable TV show. This was pre-COVID, talking about how many high-level it's always the northern Italians, because that's where, again, it's one country, but believe me, two very different economies. Many northern Italian hospital and medical leaders in northern Italy were trained literally by Anthony Fauci. So is it a coincidence that northern Italy was the first place and they would have been getting their advice personally, directly from Herr Dr. Fauci?
Mm-hmm. Another interesting thing about Italy is the strong influence of China in Italy. So it's part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and there are many Chinese workers in Italy. So there were all sorts of connections to China in Italy, and still are.